Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you in the US, or good afternoon to everybody in the UK, and welcome to this British American Business webinar, where we're going to be talking about the future of the US-UK special relationship and the political outlook for the year ahead, specifically with the implications from that political from the political situation for business, which I know is important to all of you. I'd like to start by saying a huge thanks to our good friends at EY for helping to make this event possible. We really have a terrific panel. And of course, this is a question that is absolutely central to the mission of British American business. Now, it has been fashionable in some circles over recent years to downplay the importance of the special relationship. In my view, that ignores the fundamental nature of the security relationship between the US and the UK, which tends to transcend political changes on either side of the Atlantic. And it also downplays the enormous scale of the economic relationship and the trust between the two countries that underpins that economic relationship, that allows people to make investments in confidence. Interestingly, of course, Biden's first call outside of North America was to Boris, désolé, Monsieur Macron, and it's likely that the first visit overseas will be to the UK in June for the G7, if he doesn't have to self-isolate in a hotel for 14 days first, of course. And it's been a central part of British American businesses' work over the last year, looking at the trade relationship between the US and the UK, and that's going to be a part of our conversation today. So to lead us through the discussion and to introduce our panelists, I'm delighted to say that we have a real expert in his own right. Brad Staples is the CEO of the global advisory and communications firm APCO. So Brad, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Duncan, and I'm delighted to be with you all today. Let me begin with just a few housekeeping points, if I can. We're going to have opening remarks from Anthony Phillipson for the first 10 minutes, followed by 35 minutes of moderated discussion from the panel, and then we'll open the rest of the session up to a Q&A for listeners and participants. Everybody is on a listen-only mode. If you're an attendee or participant, your mics are muted, but we would encourage you to ask questions and to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to put forward any questions that you might have. The session is being recorded, and if you'd like to have a recording of the session, you're welcome to receive that upon request. So let me introduce, with no further ado, Anthony Phillipson, who's the British Consul General in New York and Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America. Anthony, let me begin by I think, framing this moment. We're 1 month into the new trade and geopolitical relationship between the EU and the UK, where we're in the first week, or coming towards the end of the first week, of the new administration in the US. And we're looking ahead to a year in which the UK will chair COP26 and the presidency of the G7. So what's ahead for the UK-US relationship in this auspicious year?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Brad. And it's a pleasure to join you all from New York this morning. So let me jump straight in and whiz through some of the headlines of, as I say, what's going to, I think, be a very, very big year for the UK, including here in the US. As Duncan said, last weekend, the Prime Minister was the first European leader to speak to President Biden after his inauguration 1 week ago today. Some may have seen the summary from number 10, but the two leaders look forward to deepening the close alliance between our nations. The Prime Minister warmly welcomed the President's decision to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change, as well as the World Health Organization, and indeed the COVAX program to ensure equitable access for vaccines. They noted the significant challenges facing the world during the pandemic, but also the unparalleled opportunities to build back better and greener together, both phrases that the Prime Minister and the President have used themselves over the last few months. The Prime Minister praised President Biden's early action on tackling climate change and commitment to reach net zero by 2050, something that we've also legislated to do. And then really picking up on Duncan's point, I mean, all of this is in the context of our long history of cooperation in security and defence, leaders recommitted to the NATO alliance and our shared values in promoting human rights and protecting democracy. They also did discuss the benefits of a potential free trade deal between the UK and the US, and the PM reiterated his intention to try and resolve existing trade issues between us as soon as possible. And they look forward to meeting in person, ideally as soon as possible, and to working together through the G7 and the COP, as Brad mentioned. Also the G20, I think, is going to be another important place for us to work together. So let me quickly unpack a few themes that underpin all of this. And first, let's start with the UK-EU agreement reached on Christmas Eve last year. Obviously, this matters to the UK in terms of our relationship with the EU, but I think it also matters enormously to US investors in the UK and also to the President, given the importance that he has stressed of maintaining the gains of the Northern Ireland peace process and objectives that the Prime Minister has made clear to him that we fully share. The deal between the UK and the EU is based on friendly cooperation between sovereign equals, centred on free trade and inspired by our shared history and values, and indeed our ambition to deepen that history going forward, as it were. This is the first free trade agreement that the EU has ever reached based on zero tariffs and zero quotas. That's good news in our view for businesses and consumers in every part of the United Kingdom. From financial services through to automotive manufacturing, the deal protects high quality jobs and investment right across the UK. And people will be able to continue to buy goods from Europe tariff-free, protecting consumer prices. The deal also secures continued market access across a broad scope of key service sectors, including professional business services, and supporting new and continued investment between businesses in the UK and the EU. It also means that business travellers, one day we hope, will be able to easily move between the EU and the UK for short-term visits, and the agreement on financial services ensures financial stability and consumer protection. The negotiations will continue in various areas, including discussions that will take place between now and March on a financial services MOU, and agreements on both sides on equivalence, also some important discussions ongoing about data adequacy arrangements. The deal delivers, as I say, for the entire UK, including importantly protecting the integrity of our internal market and Northern Ireland's place within it. We will now continue to engage businesses and sectors that are affected by our changing relationship with the EU to help them adjust and continue to successfully compete on the global stage. Part of that, of course, involves creating new opportunities for them through free trade agreements, including with the US. So let me turn to that now. We have said often, including from the Prime Minister to the President, that we believe that a free trade agreement between us can provide certainty that we can work together in building back better, particularly as we seek to secure resilient supply chains and lead the world in showing that cooperation and free trade are crucial to a global recovery. This agreement, in our view, is also an opportunity to set global best practice by future-proofing it to take account of changing technology requirements and regulations in developing areas of the economy. Starting in May 2020, as many of you will know, we had concluded 5 rounds covering all aspects of negotiations across a comprehensive set of issues. The 5th round took place from the 19th to the 30th of October, so concluded just before the presidential election on the 3rd of November. That was the most intensive round of negotiations that we had held, with 38 sessions covering 19 different chapter areas. Almost all chapter areas are now in the advanced stages of talks. A significant proportion of legal text has been agreed across multiple chapters. And indeed, since then, although we haven't had a further formal round, we have continued with exchanges between the chapter leads and what we call intersessional meetings between the 2 negotiating teams. And now, of course, we're gearing up to be able to be in a position to engage the new administration on this as they set about delivering their international priorities. We firmly believe that completing an FTA with the UK would send a strong message about renewed US international engagement and reinforce the wider defence and security relationship as we work together in addressing pressing global challenges. Getting back to basics on the FTA, we think it would boost the whole of both of our economies in sectors ranging from creative industries to life sciences, digital trade, financial services, etc. All would benefit from several of the FTA's cross-cutting chapters, including intellectual property, good regulatory practice, customs, services, rules of origin, etc. This is a deep and comprehensive agreement that we're seeking to reach between the 1st and the 5th biggest economies in the world. So the fact that we didn't complete it before the presidential election, I don't think is a surprise. This was never going to be a small undertaking. Small and medium-sized enterprises are a particular focus within the agreement. They're the backbone of our economies. 87% of UK businesses exporting to the US and 81% of the businesses importing from the US are SMEs, so it's important we get it right for them. Finally, on the trade agenda, we really want to see progress on resolving some of the frictions between us, starting with resolving the Airbus-Boeing dispute and ending the two-way tariffs, also resulting from the previous administration's decision to impose tariffs against our exports of steel and aluminium. These hurt industries that are unrelated to those at the centre of the issues, and we must find a way forward on the basis of shared commitments to supporting strategic sectors in a way that is transparent and fair, and not give others a chance to steal a march on us while we lob tariffs at each other. As the Prime Minister and the President touched on in their call, the other big economic issues for this year are climate and the G7, so let me quickly pull out a few key themes on those. The UK has long been a leader in climate action, but I think this has really accelerated in the last few months. Back in December, the Prime Minister announced an aggressive enhancement of our nationally determined contribution, the NDC, when he announced that we would reduce our emissions by 68% by 2030 compared to 1990s levels. That is seriously ambitious, and we are determined to meet it. Last November, the Prime Minister announced what he calls a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution that will create 250,000 jobs in the UK and help drive us towards our goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The Green Industrial Revolution emphasises the UK government's view that climate change is not only an economic imperative, but also an enormous economic opportunity. An environmental imperative, forgive me, but also an economic opportunity. The plan will mobilise over $15 billion worth of government investment, combined with potentially, we hope, over 3 times as much private sector investment to build green jobs and industries across the UK and to support our global engagement in the run-up to the COP26 meeting that we will co-host with Italy in Glasgow in November this year. The 10-point plan covers offshore wind, hydrogen, nuclear, electric vehicles, public transport, jet zero and greener maritime, homes and public buildings, carbon capture and storage, nature, innovation and finance. It's a comprehensive, ambitious agenda. Turning now to the G7, leaders from the world's leading democracies will come together in Cornwall in June to address shared challenges from beating coronavirus and tackling climate change to ensuring that people everywhere can benefit from open trade, technological change and scientific discovery. The G7, which of course you all know is made up of the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the USA and the EU, is the only forum where the world's most influential and open societies and advanced economies come together for detailed, close-knit discussion. And the Prime Minister's ambition is to use the G7 under his chairmanship to intensify cooperation between the world's democratic and technologically advanced nations. To that end, he has also invited leaders from Australia, India and South Korea to attend as guests to deepen the expertise and experience around the table. And between them, those 10 leaders will represent over 60% of the people living in democracies around the world. The UK will also host a number of meetings throughout the year between government ministers from the G7, both virtually and in different locations across the UK, ensuring many areas of the country experience the benefit of our presidency. And those summits will cover economic, environmental, health, trade, technology, development, and foreign policy issues. The bottom line is that we live in a global world. Viruses and global warming are not constrained by national borders, and boosting international trade and investment rests on deepening international partnerships and creating resilient supply chains. We are all in this together. That's why I think this is just such an enormous year for global Britain, as we have completed our transition out of the EU, and at the heart of it rests the UK-US relationship. As ever, a hugely important and special part of that is our dialogue with businesses on both sides of the pond. Thank you once again to BAB for putting this together and inviting me to take part. I will pause there. Thank you very much indeed.
Anthony, before we turn to the panel, can I just raise a question with you? You described, the steady and consistent progress made in the run-up to the election and the scale of the agreement, both sort of deep and comprehensive in its nature. But we've all been reading, I would imagine, indications from the president or from the likes of Janet Yellen coming in as Treasury Secretary, that the pace at which this new administration can turn to any trade agreement is going to be very much shaped by the need to make major investments domestically, to focus on rebuilding infrastructure, to upgrading so many parts of the US economy. Is a quick overall trade deal with the US administration, given its COVID priorities and all these other dimensions, realistic and possible? And are there other dimensions that can move forward as negotiations progress, maybe at a state level or sectorally? Will we see some sectors coming closer together?
Thanks very much. So as you say, I mean, we have tracked very carefully what people have been saying, both during the campaign and during the transition. And we took very careful note of the president and other key players, including, as you say, Janet Yellen, and a focus on strengthening the US economy, building back better, dealing with the COVID impacts. We continue to believe that an FTA with the UK could be a significant contribution to that, and it's a conversation that we are looking forward to having. In detail, we haven't been able to have it yet. As I say, the Prime Minister and the President have covered it in their discussions, but we need to get into a detailed discussion once Janet Yellen is firmly in office and up to speed, and I'm sure that will very soon. We're of course waiting for the confirmation of a new Commerce Secretary, which we hope will come soon, Gina Raimondo from Rhode Island, and of course the new US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai. And once they're in place, I think we will look to move quite quickly to explore the possibility of how an FTA can dock into their priorities and their agenda. We will also keep talking to the other key players in this, including the business community, both BAB, the US Chamber, all of whom have expressed their strong support for an agreement between us, including in the context of maintaining the relationship between the UK and the EU. And then there's Congress, who are always a key player on trade. I mean, in fact, I think they quite rightly see themselves as almost co-owners of the trade agenda. Their objectives set out in Trade Promotion Authority, which also brings in a timing constraint as it expires this year. But there are things that we can't change, including the hiatus as the transition works through. We're going to position ourselves to be able to move as quickly as we can with them once they're in office. And then picking up on your last point, which I think is really important, the FTA is just one of the means to an end of deepening and strengthening what is already an incredible economic relationship between the UK and the US, with biggest investors in each other's country. The US is our single biggest export market. And there are things that we will look to be doing at state level, not least because they are responsible for some issues like state level procurement or mutual recognition of professional qualifications and other issues that are the issues that we want to address between the two economies. And we will also want to talk to the US about how we handle discussions about emerging technology, telecoms diversification, as we talked about with the previous administration. And again, we will look to knit that back together with the new administration once they are in place.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anthony. Let me open up the conversation to our panelists and invite them to join us and come on screen. And I'd like to begin, if I can, with a question to Sally Jones, who's the trade strategy and Brexit leader at EY in the UK. Welcome, Sally. So how are US businesses with UK interests viewing their long-term presence in the UK now that we've decoupled ourselves from the EU and that strong bond of liberal economic values and Anglophone context that's kind of created a doorway to the EU? Now that's no longer there. What's the approach US businesses are taking to their relationship with the UK?
It's a really good question, Brad, and I think I'd like to take it in chronological chunks, if I might. So whilst entirely accepting Anthony's point that this is one of the most, if not the most ambitious deal that the EU has signed with anybody, it is still a country mile away from single market membership. So inevitably, any business which includes as part of its global footprint trade between the UK and the EU is experiencing disruption right now. And we're seeing that come across in a whole range of different ways, from the additional customs formalities which are required in order to move goods across the border, even if you get to the zero tariffs position. And to just give you a sense of how difficult that's becoming, Logistics UK, which is the trade body of the haulage industry in the UK, estimates that 1 in every 4 truck that's arriving at the border right now is turning up with incomplete or inaccurate paperwork and therefore is being turned away. So that level of disruption is there even in a zero tariffs regime. We're seeing it in a situation where zero tariffs exist if you meet all of the requirements, but certain very common UK activities have become an impossibility. So the most immediately and obvious one is UK distribution activities. If you have a situation where a US business is transferring goods to the UK for onward distribution to the UK and elsewhere, there will not be zero tariffs on the leg from the UK to the European Union countries, because the UK isn't doing sufficient to the product to meet the requirements for zero tariffs. We're seeing it in the world of VAT. So this one is very close to my heart. William Shatner of Star Trek fame has an online website selling Star Trek memorabilia, and because of the way the UK VAT rules work, he and many other businesses that sell directly to consumers will not sell to UK consumers, the only country in the world they won't sell to. On a regulatory and legal perspective, we're seeing businesses discover to their horror that they don't have the right legal structure to sell into the European Union lawfully, and vice versa. Some of that pain has been deferred by stockpiling and by COVID, but it's coming more and more to the fore. And if I were to pick one more area of disruption that is, again, not yet peaking, but is getting there, it's around mobility. So there are mobility rules that allow Brits to spend 90 days in any 180 days in the EU on visits. But the definition of visit is narrow. It includes holidays. So all of a sudden, companies now have to track not only where their people are spending business trips, but also private vacational trips. And you still sometimes need a work permit. And you still need to navigate the immigration systems of each member state. It is so far away from being free movement of people, it's really untrue. And I think that my US clients are looking at this with something close to wait and see as their attitude. That wait and see attitude has been evident for many months, actually, and it has been a very sensible attitude for many US businesses where the UK is not that significant a part of their global footprint, because why spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to get ready when you don't know what's going to happen? I think that wait and see attitude now is starting to do them a disservice if they want to keep trading between the UK and the EU in the way that they always have been, because they've now run out of time to wait and see. They now need to be taking material action if they want to preserve business as usual.
That's great. Thank you, Sally. I'm sure we will come back to some of those points as we progress. And I've seen one or two questions coming in already along the lines of some of the issues you were addressing. Let me turn to you, Doug, if I can. The history of the relationship, the trading relationship between the US and the EU as two big global trading blocs is ones of blocs that occasionally clash. And we've seen tit for tat tariffs coming from the long-running Boeing Airbus dispute, and it's not always been the easiest relationship. The UK now finds itself adrift or in the middle of these two mega trading blocs. Do you see the UK being pulled into one orbit or another, or do you think it's going to be nimble enough to sort of navigate this emerging new trade context?
Well, thank you, Brad. And, I think that's a really good question. And I'm actually glad that you asked Sally her question first, because, I think a major determinant, how that's going to play out is, what the agreement between the UK and the EU looks like. Economists have this model for explaining trade. They call it the gravity model. The basic idea is that you can explain, where trade flows sort of by proximity, geographical location, and there's a historical and database. I think the UK will always be the EU will be its major trading partner. The question really, though, is sort of around, and this gets to sort of the question of where the FTA goes as well, is around the sort of the back end of these agreements, which is regulatory standards. And as Anthony mentioned in his comments, those are still being worked through. So whether it's equivalence on financial services, regulatory standards, and how tightly the UK will be bound up in the EU's sort of orbit. And I think, I don't think it's a secret that certainly in the U.S., one of its negotiating objectives, up front with the UK was to sort of secure a more hospitable environment for U.S.-based standards, for example, so around agriculture and food safety, And I think, how the UK negotiates that with the EU, where that ends, will in large part determine, the answer to that question, which suggests that it'll be sort of a sector-specific outcome, so maybe in certain sectors. So that's a big factor. That said, I wouldn't underestimate sort of the role of, just the business culture in the UK, its areas of competitive advantage. So, I mean, you actually see, an AI industry in the UK that you don't necessarily see the same capacity or abilities in the EU. And so there will be this tension between, the EU's very aggressive measures and, its whole digital agenda, for example, and, its efforts to, move forward with that, and, what the UK will want to do and how it sort of aligns with sort of, let's say, more of the US model, which at least historically has proven to be probably a bit more conducive to innovation and the development of e-commerce companies. So I just use that as an example to say. The last point I would sort of make is what the U.S. does and the time frame that it does. As it was mentioned earlier, the U.S. has put FTAs on a hiatus. I think that is the intention. It makes some sense. But frankly, I think the administration will find that to be sort of hard to sustain that position for very long. The rest of the world's going to be moving forward, including the EU, including China, and that'll put pressure. And I think, that is the point, and if Anthony and his colleagues are, as skillful as I suggest, that'll be the point where the US will be looking, it needs to start doing something. The US has already made a great deal of progress with the UK. It would be a relatively complementary economy to negotiate an agreement with. And I think that will position the UK well when that happens. It's not going to happen in the next, 3 to 6 months. When it does, I think that sort of the medium term, I think, sort of bodes well for, the cooperation between the two countries and codifying that in an FTA.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doug. I mean, I think you very eloquently highlighted a dynamic tension there that exists, with the EU looking to bind the UK to a body of regulatory standards and the US pressing for that more hospitable environment. And you focused on innovation, and maybe Stephanie, we could transition to that issue. There are a host of issues beyond sort of product tariffs and similar areas. We've got a digital services tax. We've got new regulation, digital services, digital marketing acts being proposed from the EU side of things. But we have a more predictable, one anticipates, new administration in the US, certainly compared to its predecessor. And do you see that as an opportunity for the UK to be able to navigate this environment with greater certainty, or are we going to see it caught up in almost an inevitable tension here between these different dynamics?
So I think it's a really good question, and I might start just by saying that, it can feel a little bit fuzzy sometimes when we talk about political multilateralism as an important driving force of kind of collaboration between countries. But I think it's important. And in particular, the last 4 years of the Trump administration indicated what the global environment can feel like, what these kind of multilateral efforts can feel like when one of the major partners isn't seen as a kind of consistent partner, or is seen as relatively unpredictable in terms of behaviors and treatment of allies. I think under Biden, that's just a very different world. I think President Biden has been very clear, even in his initial actions, signing back up to the Paris Agreement, signing back up to the World Health Organization. These kinds of acts really indicate that President Biden wants the United States to be part of political multilateralism and the rules-based kind of global order. And I think for businesses, that's really encouraging and positive, because it provides a sense of consistency, of certainty, of that the United States, and the relationship with the UK, the relationship with Europe, that those things are not things we need to worry about, that there's not a kind of sense of sudden uncertainty. But what I always say is that political kind of friendship doesn't mean that you never fall out, right? Just like with your own friends, you may fall out with your friends, but you always know that you're friends. And I think under the Trump administration, that certainty about these relationships felt less obvious or felt less present. And I think businesses felt that in terms of not knowing the environment in which they might want to invest in their businesses or kind of build new relationships. I think for specifically under the Biden administration, those issues, as I said, should be less severe, should actually be much more kind of stable. I think the challenge is, what can you do? What can you action? For example, in the digital taxation space, it's an area that clearly the EU wants to move forward on, but there are kind of political realities within the United States that we can't kind of underestimate. So while I think there'll be negotiation, Biden will be more active participant, that's not to say everything's smooth sailing. Like any good relationship, it's not always smooth sailing, but at least we'll have a sense of that certainty that there's a willingness to try. I think there ultimately, though, initiatives like the digital tax are going to come down to the nitty gritty of, is the United States comfortable with the 2 pillars that the OECD taxation initiative is pushing? I think they're comfortable with the minimum tax side of things. They're not as comfortable with the implications it has in terms of profitability in different regions and how you capture that. So there's real kind of nuts and bolts stuff that might affect the ultimate outcome, but I think the path to get there might feel a little bit more predictable and at least a little bit more positive for businesses trying to understand this environment.
And Stephanie, you're giving counsel and advice at Aberdeen Standard from a point of view of a political economist. Are your clients feeling confident or anxious in the context of everything you just said, right? I mean, we're anticipating some degree of predictability, but or is there, do we still have this wait and see approach that Sally was describing before from some of those you're talking to?
So I think for us, because it's mostly investors, we're an investor ourselves, a lot of our clients are investors, there was a lot of caution, and you can see that in the behavior of the markets over the last 4 years. There was caution, there was uncertainty, particularly around things like the US-China relationship, which has implications for many companies, given the globalized nature of supply chains. I think now the expectation among investors is that we will have a more predictable, if not a much more kind of positive US-China relationship, at least a more predictable one. And for investors, that's super important, is just to having a sense that there is predictability, even if it's not an outright positive, improvement in the relationship. More broadly, I think what the US administration is bringing, and this is really going into economist world, but it's we expect a big fiscal impulse, and that's good for the US economy and it's good for the global economy. We think that's positive for the investment environment in general and for businesses to feel supported through what is just an incredibly unprecedented crisis. What this new administration is bringing is a sense that the fiscal support for businesses and for households will be there. And we see that as super, super positive for the overall environment.
Great. Let me open this up to all of you, or for whomever wants to answer this one. Beyond the predictability and the certainty that the new administration brings, and the confidence for investors that Stephanie was just talking to, I guess there's a huge opportunity around building back better, which both the US and UK like to use in equal measure, but doing it from a position of green investment opportunities and a new greening of the economy. And this is clearly a huge priority for the UK as it chairs COP26 in Glasgow later in the year. What should we expect? What should businesses expect in terms of green investment opportunities? And is there anything that we might see emerge or develop in the run-up to the Glasgow session? I don't know, maybe Sally or Douglas, you might want to make a comment on that.
Doug, I'll arm wrestle you over who gets to answer first.
Go ahead. Ladies first.
You're such a gentleman. So can I make a handful of observations about what I see as an important feature, which is the possible alignment of trade agreements and environmental measures, which have historically been very separate. So on the one hand, we've had the WTO system for international norms. On the other hand, we've had things like the Paris Climate Agreement, and the two have not met. But most people would accept that by converging the two, you're likely to get much, much more powerful outcomes. And we're seeing a wonderful alliance of Costa Rica, New Zealand and Norway coming together on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, really starting to make real positive moves around bringing the two together in the hope of creating something bigger and better. So we're seeing things like proposed measures on determining how you measure and report environmental measures, eco-labeling, sustainable product standards, reporting and maintaining and reducing the levels of transportation emissions. All of those are starting to really come to the fore in the trade space, and the hope has got to be that the US and the UK can really work together and with others to push that forward, with COP26 as the lightning rod that brings all of these different pieces of initiative into one place. I'm massively positive. I think trade ought to play a really big part in all of this, and that there are some really, really important things that we can do together on this one.
Yeah, and I think Sally's really made a very good point. I would just expand on it in the following way. I think, you know, the ability of the Biden administration to sort of use these, what are, you know, called executive orders to sort of alter the regulatory and rule space will really sort of encourage you know, green investment, and obviously that'll translate into business opportunities. Where it gets a little bit more complicated on the U.S. side is that if you look at sort of the, you know, the tax discussion within the, you know, by certainly the Biden campaign, you know, it was very much, there was this linkage made between, you know, altering, you know, corporate tax rates, mostly for going up in one form or another, and linking that to funding sort of this green build out. So in other words, the Biden administration wasn't necessarily putting forward a tax reform plan. What it was putting forward was, these are measures required to fund a green build out. And that becomes a function of what you can and cannot do in the US Congress. And so that makes it a little bit more complicated. And as a suggestion, there'll be some, you know, potentially benefits, in opportunities and infrastructure build, but it may also come with, you know, potential different tax implications for companies. So a mixed message.
I think as well, just on the green policy, I think clearly the Biden administration has already acted super quickly. And as Doug kind of mentioned, particularly the regulatory space seems like a place where there's just a lot of space to reverse the actions taken during the Trump administration and go further. Again, for when it comes to Congress, I think I'm going to be watching people like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, the senator from West Virginia, as a key kind of linchpin in all of this, because the nature of the Democratic majority in the Senate is just so narrow, right? It's 50-50 plus the VP, they get over the marker, so they can't lose anyone. So you have to have Bernie Sanders on board and you have to have Joe Manchin on board. And that's I think that's going to essentially create certain incentives to make sure that the kinds of environmental policies you see maybe are more focused on tax credits. And again, I mean, I agree with Doug. I think that the environmental infrastructure side of things will be partially offset by these rises in tax, probably not back to the full 28%, but maybe to somewhere around kind of 25. And then the other point I just make is that businesses, I think, have a huge opportunity to be part of this. If anything, actually, it's quite striking in the United States, just the extent to which large businesses and small businesses have been rallying around this idea that climate change is an issue and is something that needs to be tackled. And so in some ways, obviously, we're very focused on what the administration will change and what the UK government can do, but businesses also clearly have this, incredibly powerful role to really accelerate climate policy action and to work with government. And when we do climate policy assessments at ASI, we call it like smart climate policy. So is the government working with business? Is business working with government to move the climate agenda forward? Because we think that's just crucial to action being taken in a way that works for business and works for the government.
Yeah, and I would just echo that from a position of, our organization in offering advisory and advocacy services to clients both in Washington, in London, and in Brussels. the new engagement with the Biden administration is more and more being driven with environmental messages front and center, from heavy industry through to tech and service providers wanting to have this at the forefront of all they're saying in terms of their engagement with this administration, as well as with Brussels and in London at the same time. I want to pull in a question that Duncan's raised from the chat and open it up to the panelists, and it's the question, and I guess it's one of these triangulation issues, right? The UK now finds itself in an interesting position in relation to the trade relationship with China. The EU seized the moment at the end of last year to establish a new investment agreement with China. And the Biden administration has been giving clear indications that it wants a clear and certain and quite forthright approach when it comes to trade with China. I guess my question is to you all, where does that leave the UK in this? And what do we anticipate in terms of the approach the UK will take to welcoming investment from China, but at the same time wanting to balance these other relationships as well? But anyone want to talk about the China dynamic here, which is clearly so relevant?
I mean, I can jump in as a first start. So I think that where we're going to hear a lot more around China trade relations, and to Sally's point earlier about linking trade and the environment, I think as well you'll see another nexus develop, which is trade and human rights. And in particular, I think that's something that the UK government has already commented on in the last year or so. And I think you'll see more and more of that, because the Biden administration and the Democratic Party writ large is much more kind of outspoken and much more concerned about alleged human rights abuses in China and in Hong Kong. And I think that's going to be something that's going to continue to create opportunities for the US, the UK, and Europe to align and to engage with China. And again, you know, being a part of these political multilateral events, you know, like COP26, but also like the G20, they can seem a little fuzzy and, you know, what's the point of them? But actually, I think you'll see much more alignment between these major countries and discussion about these big issues around human rights. And I think you'll see that tied more and more to issues like trade policy, because for the Biden administration, it's just going to be so central. And I think the UK has already in recent past been relatively outspoken on this. And I think you'll just see more of an alignment on that.
Yeah, I think Stephanie's right in terms of sort of the content. I think the challenge for the UK is, and I say this as a former trade negotiator, is sort of leverage. And you know, how does the UK sort of move forward its relationship with China? It will not have sort of the same negotiating heft that either the EU or the US has vis-a-vis China, and so, you know, that could be a good thing. It may give it a little bit more some negotiating space, but by and large, it's probably going to be, you know, put the UK more in a position of being a taker. And so its ability to, you know, push human rights or, you know, labor conventions, it's hard to see it, you know, being more than what the EU has done, for example. So I would sort of expect maybe a more modest agenda on those issues. But commercially, you know, may have a little more flexibility. But again, it'll also be kind of subject to the same phenomena I described, where, you know, the warm embrace of the EU and, you know, what it can do on its own and what it can't.
And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that although the Trump administration's approach of very aggressive policy to try and affect change in China's approach to the international norms has not, by most measures, been successful, many of the issues that administration raised have some validity, whether it's around currency manipulation or whether it's around the role that China has taken in terms of steel. So there are, and a number of other places. Equally, the US administration's position on the WTO has likewise had some validity in its concerns, and I think if we can build towards a more solid international consensus of, number one, what those concerns are, and number two, how to address those in a more positive way, whether human rights abuses or otherwise, then that can only be a positive thing globally. Great,
thank you all for those comments and input on that important dynamic. I'd actually like to invite Anthony to rejoin us and take some of the questions that we've been getting from the floor. And if those attending have questions, then please drop them into the Q&A session or into the Q&A box or into the chat that we're having. Andre's asked a question which I'll throw out to you all, including to Anthony. Could we talk a little bit about the transatlantic data flows issue? There's a triangle shaping up with the UK waiting for an EU adequacy decision and the US and EU negotiating an updated privacy shield. What can we expect in the short and medium terms in relation to transatlantic data flows? Who would be interested in grabbing that one? It's quite specific.
Can I make an observation about that EU-UK leg of the triangle?
Sure.
So I'm going to kind of recap briefly because it's about GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which may not be enormously familiar to some people on this call. So the GDPR sets out a framework that allows both data to be shared between EU member states and between member states and third countries. And a lot of people assumed it was going to be a slam dunk for the UK to obtain this so-called adequacy decision from the Commission because we'd implemented GDPR. What people didn't take into account was that the test applied to third countries is much more stringent than the test applied to member states. For member states, the test is essentially, have you implemented GDPR in full and correctly? Yes, no. And if the answer is yes, data can flow. With third countries, it's a much broader test. It effectively becomes, have we, the Commission, received sufficient evidence that this third country, if we take its legislation and statute in the round, will offer our citizens a same level of protection as they enjoy in the EU? And that's an incredibly difficult hurdle to pass. And in fact, the US hasn't passed that hurdle and has never received an adequacy decision. The UK was hoping for an adequacy decision before 31 December when the transition period ran out. It didn't receive it effectively because the Commission ran out of time. We now have, within the terms of the EU-UK agreement, a 4 months or by mutual agreement 6 month period in which the Commission can still take that adequacy decision. It's by no means certain that that will happen. When I'm feeling optimistic, I'm reminded of the fact that the UK has implemented GDPR and has been operating it very successfully for a couple of years now, so it ought to be fine. When I'm feeling sort of less optimistic, I'm reminded that Canada is pretty much the only country that has an adequacy ruling with equivalent levels of legislation as we have. And that worries me because obviously data flows between the EU and Canada and the EU and the UK are a different scale of magnitude. The UK had a fallback position if we didn't get an adequacy decision. We were going to take the US privacy shield and cross out US and put UK all the way through, which was fine until it was struck out by the Schrems II case over the summer before the Court of Justice of the EU. Where we go from there is really difficult to tell because there are some voices, admittedly radicals and outliers, but there are some voices in the EU who are suggesting that maybe data shouldn't flow to either the UK or the US in its current format and with its current freedoms. I don't think they'll prevail. But data is such an enormous issue, how it's held, how it's manipulated and used, who controls it, where it's hosted. That seems to me that the EU has such a gold plate standard that both the US and the UK are in a broadly similar position where they may simply never be able to meet the EU's requirements here. Whether the EU softens its stance or whether it forces the UK and the US and many, many, many other countries to up their game is, I think, not yet determined.
Great, thank you, Sally. Let me take a much broader question. We've had a question here about global trade and whether or not we'll start to see more of a focus on national investments post COVID-19 and Trump. I mean, clearly we're our whole conversation here is about establishing a new framework for UK-US trade in the context of an evolving situation with the EU post-Brexit. But does anybody believe that we're going to see an orientation towards more national investments or more of a kind of nationalistic approach in this context, or are we confident? I think Stephanie was the confident sort of multilateralist here, but how do you see it? Maybe you want to take the question, Stephanie.
Well, so I'd say I'm confident in political multilateralism, but maybe not so much economic multilateralism. And what I mean is, I think through the COVID crisis and through the reality that the Biden administration, while it sounds quite different to the Trump administration, many of the ideals around Build Back Better are relatively domestically focused. So it's not to say that there aren't transnational opportunities. Of course there are, but it's more to say that I think that there will be lots of national investment going on, both through this period as governments continue to have to support their country through what is quite a challenging pandemic and economic crisis, and also specifics about this crisis. The fact that it was a health crisis. People may recall issues around PPE at the beginning of the crisis, that there wasn't enough protective equipment in certain countries. And the EU actually, for a while, didn't allow the export of PPE in cases where there wasn't enough in particular countries. I think we're starting to see that now with vaccines as well, where again, it seems to be a European issue, where there's talk of the Pfizer vaccine not being exported to third countries unless it's kind of satisfying its EU requirements. So all those kinds of things, I think, will continue to be an issue through this phase of the pandemic and through the recovery as countries try to rebuild. I think that's just a reality of the world that we're in. The impact of kind of populism, I think, is being felt in a real way. None of that is to say there aren't opportunities. Clearly, we still live in a globalized trading system, but the nature of those trading relationships might change. Might get more, what we expect is a little bit more regionalization of trade relationships. So maybe EU, UK, US nexus, more of an Asian nexus. I think these are kind of the long-term consequences that come from particularly the bipolar world we live in, where we have the US and China as these two big forces kind of pulling apart. So again, I think there are opportunities in that world, but it's to say COVID and the very specific kind of crisis it's created has made national investment a priority for governments kind of across the world, but particularly in developed markets. And I think we'll continue to see that be an important part of the world we're in, if not the only important part.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
I was just going to say, I would just echo, and I think that sort of nationalistic, and I would even utter the P word, protectionism, is being codified. I mean, in China, it goes by, its dual circulation policy. In the EU, autonomous strategic, open strategic autonomy. That's putting trying to put a multilateral face on it, but it will have aspects. And as Stephanie pointed out, the gap between the Trump and the Biden administration on some of these issues, very much it's a different approach. But what did the Biden administration do yesterday? Buy America provisions, which are essentially a more restrictive covenant requiring U.S. production. So companies are going to have to navigate just more I think it's been pointed out, there are opportunities, but the reality is it's more complicated now, and sort of benign globalism can't be taken as a granted going forward.
I wonder, Anthony, if you could just reflect on some of these factors. We're witnessing this tendency towards economic nationalism, the desire to rebuild the infrastructure in the US example, and I guess in that context, the UK-US trade relationship is not like every other international trade relationship. It's intimate, it's a long-standing one, and potentially there's a context here, even with that orientation, that UK business could benefit from. Do you see these factors shaping where we're headed in terms of this relationship, in terms of the agreement's progress, but also beyond that, in terms of the health of the relationship overall?
Thanks very much, and just thank you to the panel. I really, really enjoyed listening to their discussion around the other themes and some, hugely important issues. I mean, maybe just a couple of thoughts, because I think these are enormous topics and they deserve to be properly unpacked. And I think that's what we're all going to spend quite a lot of our time doing over the coming weeks and months. I mean, maybe if I go half a step back, it just feels to me that quite a lot of our normal assumptions about both the world that we live in and how things are going to work have been just fundamentally changed by events over the previous 5 years, including the UK, I think, as Sally said right at the top. You know, we should not underestimate the significance of the UK leaving the single market and the customs union. And, you know, that is a fundamental change of relationship between the UK and the EU. I think the point I'd make is that, yes, I entirely take her points about, even if we have done lots of positive things in the agreement, that there are still some, you know, it's a significant step away from previous relationships. But A, that's a function of a decision that was made by the British people. Secondly, I think the key thing now to focus on what is the discussion going forward. I mean, there are, I think, 19 joint committees that have been set up that will govern this relationship between the UK and the EU. I think it'll be fundamentally important for us to feed into those discussions all the things you've talked about, whether it's the data relationships, MRAs, rules of origin, customs procedures, et cetera, in order to understand sort of the lived experience, and we're still only 27 days into it, and you know, keep enhancing and improving going forward from where we are. And within that is the question about where you seize the opportunities. And I think the question, again, Sally, I thought, set it out brilliantly in terms of the issues around data and the relationship between Privacy Shield and GDPR. And rather simplistically, I would say that I think, you know, that's one of the areas where there needs to be now an EU, US, UK discussion about the way forward. And it needs to understand how, if we don't get it right between the three of us, the rest of the global economy will evolve, driven by others who will not have the same strategic objectives as we do, potentially. And you can then ripple that principle out into areas like AI, quantum, etc. And I think that's, you know, from a UK point of view, when we talk about global Britain, it's about having multifaceted relationships. I would say that the US relationship is going to be our most important strategic trade and economic relationship for some time to come in terms of single countries. But in terms of relationships with other blocs, obviously there's UK EU. Then there's the role that we want to play within potentially even CPTPP, where the government has announced an ambition to exceed. Then you're into the other organizations, G7, WTO, OECD, fundamentally important. We haven't talked about digital services tax, but that's going to be a fundamentally important place to resolve issues around that. And I think the real challenge for the UK is, and going back to the point that was made about leverage, you know, our leverage, I think, comes from the alliances that we already are part of. Some I've mentioned, some I haven't already. Commonwealth, NATO, et cetera, and then the new relationships that we're going to have to create and the new places that we're going to have to create to discuss the norms and standards of the future of the global economy. As I say, those are enormous issues. Circling right back to the UK-US piece, as well as the FTA, you know, we need to understand the necessary science and innovation cooperation agreements that we want for the future. We've got a big push on business mobility alongside the FTA in terms of enhancing the movement of people between the UK and the US economies. Actually, we are behind where some others are, such as Australia and Chile. So we need to look at that. The US, I'm sure, will continue to deepen and strengthen its relationships through USMCA, as well as other areas. And then final thought for me, I think we really need to challenge ourselves to think about what the future of the global economy is going to look like. Because actually maybe trade policy and bilateral free trade agreements will not be necessarily the main drivers of the creation of the standards and the frameworks that we will need to operate within. I think they will play a role, but I think, you know, the economy is changing fast, driven by external impulses, but also just the sheer disruption created by tech within all the sectors of our economy. And that's where we need to try and locate the conversation. But first of all, we really need to unpack some of the questions a bit more coherently than I just did then. Thanks. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Well, I think this extraordinary panel and Anthony's contribution have demonstrated we've given this a good go, Duncan. So I'm handing back to you, but I think we've more than scratched the surface on some of these complex issues.
Well, you have, and let me just say thank you, Brad, first of all, to you for moderating the discussion so brilliantly and touching on so many issues. Also, thanks to our panelists, Sally, Doug, Stephanie, and to Anthony for topping and tailing the discussion so well. And in a sense, you kind of set the scene for a lot of the conversations that we're going to be bringing people together over the next few months. Deglobalization, the importance of data flows and data policy, the the attitude towards supranational bodies and multilateralism, the kind of decoupling with China, and sustainability and climate change risk, which all of our member companies are talking about, and the role that those companies can play in discussions with government, the FTA, base erosion and profit shifting. All of these topics and more are, can fill an hour on their own, and they will in future British American business events that we have planned. So thank you all very much for your contribution. Thanks to the audience for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at another BAB event in the not too distant future. Thanks a lot. Thank you all very much. Whew. That was a great discussion, really good discussion.